When Ryan, a hard-working marketing expert, is fired by his ruthless boss Kevin after years of dedication, his life takes a sharp turn. Struggling but determined, Ryan rebuilds himself from the ground up, starting his own agency and stealing clients away from Kevin's failing company. But when an unexpected opportunity arises, Ryan secretly buys Kevin's crumbling company and takes control. The tables are turned as Ryan publicly fires Kevin in a dramatic power play, but Kevin isn't done yet. Launching a vicious smear campaign, Kevin threatens to destroy everything Ryan has built. In a final scandalous showdown, Ryan reveals Kevin's darkest secrets, but not without questioning whether his thirst for revenge has made him more like the man he set out to destroy. A gripping story of betrayal, revenge, and the price of justice. I never thought losing everything could be the start of something bigger. For 5 years, I had given my blood, sweat, and sanity to Wilton Corp., a mid-sized marketing agency that promised opportunity but delivered something closer to a slow-motion train wreck. It wasn't always bad. In fact, in the beginning, I loved my job. I loved the thrill of taking on big clients, pitching campaigns, and seeing my work plastered across billboards and digital screens. I thought I had found a place where I could grow, make a name for myself, and maybe, just maybe, build a future. But I had one major problem: my boss, Kevin. Kevin was a walking nightmare wrapped in an expensive suit. The kind of guy who measured success by how many people he could step on to climb the corporate ladder. He wasn't just demanding, he was vindictive, mean-spirited, and always looking for someone to blame when things went south. To Kevin, employees weren't people, they were pawns. He thrived on humiliating others, especially in front of a crowd. And yet, for years, I told myself to suck it up. That it would get better. That if I worked hard enough, Kevin would finally see my value. But Kevin wasn't the type to recognize value in anyone but himself. I'll never forget the day it all fell apart. I had just landed one of the biggest clients in Wilton Corp's history. It wasn't an easy sell, either. The client, a major tech company with a budget that could fund a small nation, had rejected Wilton's pitches twice before. But I kept at it, revising the proposal, analyzing the client's needs, and presenting a campaign that was practically bulletproof. When the contract was signed, it felt like a career-defining moment. I was sure this would be the turning point. Finally, Kevin would have to acknowledge my worth. Instead, he called me into his office and fired me. I can still picture the smug look on his face as he leaned back in his chair, spinning a pen between his fingers. "Ryan," he started, his voice dripping with faux concern, "I've decided to let you go." "Let me go?" I repeated, stunned. "What are you talking about? I just brought in the biggest client we've ever had." Kevin shrugged, as if I'd pointed out something irrelevant. "You've been underperforming," he said, his tone casual. "It's nothing personal. We just need someone who can deliver consistent results." I wanted to scream. Underperforming? I had practically carried this company on my back. And consistent results? If anyone was inconsistent, it was Kevin. He'd botched deals, alienated clients, and created a toxic work environment that drove talent away in droves. But there was no use arguing. Kevin had already made up his mind. Or maybe he just needed someone to blame for his own failures. Either way, I was done. As I packed up my desk, I tried to keep my head high, but inside, I was seething. It wasn't just the injustice of it all, it was the humiliation. I had given everything to this job, sacrificed late nights and weekends, only to be thrown out like yesterday's trash. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I made a silent promise to myself: Kevin would regret this. I didn't know how or when, but one day, I would make him pay. At first, I didn't know what to do. Losing my job wasn't just a blow to my ego, it was a financial disaster. I had bills to pay, rent due, and no safety net to fall back on. The first few weeks were brutal. I spent hours combing through job boards, sending out resumes, and waiting for calls that never came. But as the rejections piled up, something inside me shifted. I realized I didn't want another job. I didn't want to work for another Kevin. So, I decided to bet on myself. It started small. I reached out to a few former clients I had worked with at Wilton Corp, offering my services as a freelance consultant. To my surprise, many of them were eager to work with me again. They had been just as fed up with Kevin's antics as I was and were happy to jump ship. The first few projects were tough. I was a one-man operation, juggling everything from creative work to client management to invoicing, but I was determined to make it work. And it did work. Slowly but surely, I built a reputation as someone who delivered results without the arrogance or drama. Word spread, and before I knew it, I had more clients than I could handle. By the end of the first year, I had saved enough money to rent a small office and hire a couple of employees. By the second year, my little freelance gig had grown into a full-fledged agency. But even as my business flourished, I couldn't shake the bitterness I felt toward Kevin. Every time I heard his name or saw Wilton Corp mentioned in the industry, it felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to move on, to focus on my own success, but the memory of what he had done to me lingered like a dark cloud. And then, one day, I got a call that changed everything. It was from a former coworker who still worked at Wilton Corporation. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice practically dripping with glee. "Kevin's finally screwed up. Big time. Apparently, things hadn't been going well for Wilton Corp since I left. Kevin's leadership, or lack thereof, had driven away key clients, and the company's profits were in freefall. The board of directors was panicking, desperate to stop the bleeding. They had decided to sell the company, hoping to offload it before things got worse. Hearing this news felt like a door opening. For the first time in 2 years, I saw a way to get even, not just with Kevin, but with the entire system that had allowed someone like him to thrive. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to take back what had been taken from me. The plan came together almost too perfectly. With the help of an investor I had partnered with on another project, I put together an offer to buy Wilton Corporation. I made sure to keep my name off the paperwork, using a holding company to mask my involvement. I didn't want Kevin, or anyone else, getting wind of what was coming. A month later, the deal was finalized. I was the new owner of Wilton Corp. And Kevin had no idea. Walking back into the offices of Wilton Corp was like stepping into a time capsule. The same dull beige walls, the same cheap carpet that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the early 2000s, the same faint smell of stale coffee mixed with desperation. I hated this place, and yet, as I stood in the lobby that morning, I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. 2 years ago, I had walked out of here broken and humiliated. Today, I was walking back in as the new owner. No one recognized me at first. Why would they? When I'd worked here, I'd been just another overworked employee, a face in the crowd. I wasn't the kind of guy who made waves, at least not publicly. But now, everything was different. I'd come back with a new look, a tailored suit that fit perfectly, shoes polished to a mirror shine, and the confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. The receptionist glanced at me nervously as I walked past her desk without checking in. She probably thought I was some VIP client. In a way, she wasn't wrong. I didn't waste time wandering around or reminiscing. I headed straight for the conference room. It was Tuesday morning, which meant Kevin would be holding his weekly staff meeting. I couldn't think of a better time to make my entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear Kevin's voice from inside. He was lecturing his team about stepping up and taking ownership, which was ironic coming from a man who had spent his entire career dodging responsibility. I pushed the door open without knocking and walked in, letting the sound of my footsteps announce my arrival. The room fell silent. Kevin stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open as he turned to look at me. His brow furrowed in confusion, and for a moment, I could see him trying to place me. I gave him a small smile, the kind that says I know something you don't. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his tone laced with irritation. Kevin hated being interrupted, especially when he was holding court in front of his team. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked to the head of the table, the spot Kevin always claimed for himself, and set my briefcase down. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, the tension in the room so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kevin's face turned a deeper shade of red with each passing second. "Seriously," he snapped, his voice rising. "Who the hell do you think you are, barging in here like this?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, placing them neatly on the table. Then I looked Kevin in the eye and said the words I'd been waiting 2 years to say. "I'm your new boss." The color drained from Kevin's face. For a moment, I thought he might actually faint. What are you talking about?" he stammered. I tapped the top sheet of the stack, the official acquisition papers. "Wilton Corp was sold last month. I'm the one who bought it. So, effective immediately, I own this company." The room erupted into whispers. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, some of them struggling to hide their grins. Kevin, on the other hand, looked like he'd just been punched in the gut. He grabbed the papers and started flipping through them, his hands shaking slightly. As he read, his expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "This has to be some kind of joke," he muttered. "There's no way." "It's not a joke, Kevin," I interrupted, keeping my tone calm but firm. "You've run this company into the ground. The board had no choice but to sell. And now, here we are." Kevin stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over," he spat. "You don't know the first thing about running a company." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny, coming from you. But let's not make this personal. This is just business, right?" The words hit their mark. Kevin's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he was too angry to speak. He looked around the room, probably hoping someone would back him up, but no one did. The employees were tired of him, and I could see the relief on their faces as they realized his reign of terror might finally be over. I decided to twist the knife a little deeper. "Actually, Kevin," I said, leaning forward slightly, "there is one personal matter we need to address. Effective immediately, you're fired." The room went completely silent. Even the whispers stopped as everyone turned to stare at Kevin. He froze, his face a mixture of shock and rage. You can't do that," he said weakly. "I can," I replied, my voice steady. "And I just did. Security will escort you out. You can leave your company laptop and any other property on the way." Kevin's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked around the room again, his eyes darting from face to face, but no one came to his defense. Finally, he slammed the papers down on the table and stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hall until they faded completely. For a moment, no one said anything. Then, one of the employees, a woman named Lisa, who I remembered as one of Kevin's frequent targets, let out a quiet, nervous laugh. It was like a dam breaking. The room erupted into relieved chuckles, some of them clapping softly. I held up a hand to silence them. "Let's save the celebrations for later. We've got work to do." That got their attention. The employees quickly sobered up, sitting straighter in their chairs as they waited for me to continue. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them. These people had been through hell under Kevin's leadership, and if I was going to turn this company around, I needed their trust. "Here's the deal," I said. "I'm not Kevin. I don't believe in running a company through fear or intimidation. I believe in results. And I believe the best way to get results is by giving people the support and respect they deserve. So, if you're willing to stick around, I promise you things are going to change." The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. The employees weren't just sitting there out of fear, they were listening. A few of them nodded, their expressions cautious but hopeful. It was a start. I glanced at my watch. That's all for now. I'll be meeting with each of you individually over the next few days to discuss your roles and the direction we're heading. For now, get back to work. The employees began to file out of the room, murmuring quietly to each other. Lisa paused as she walked past me. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes filled with genuine gratitude. I nodded, watching as she disappeared into the hallway. When the room was finally empty, I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The first step was done. Kevin was gone, and the company was mine. But this wasn't just about taking Wilton Corp away from him. It was about proving something, to myself, to the employees, and to everyone else who had doubted me. The real work was just beginning. For the next few days, the office buzzed with a mix of nervous energy and cautious optimism. The employees didn't quite know what to make of me yet. Some seemed genuinely hopeful that I'd be better than Kevin, though, to be fair, the bar was so low it was practically underground. Others, understandably, were skeptical. They had been burned too many times to trust anyone in a position of power. I didn't blame them. Trust wasn't something I could demand, it was something I had to earn. I started by meeting with each employee one-on-one. I wanted to hear directly from them about their frustrations, their goals, and what they needed to succeed. For some, it was the first time anyone had asked for their opinion. They weren't used to being treated like their voices mattered. I could see the hesitation in their eyes, the way they glanced at the door as if expecting Kevin to burst in at any moment and shut the conversation down. But as the meetings went on, the walls started to come down. Lisa, for example, had been with the company for almost 10 years. She was one of the most talented account managers I'd ever worked with, but Kevin had spent years tearing her down, blaming her for mistakes that weren't hers and micromanaging her until she could barely function. Honestly, she admitted, I was planning to quit by the end of the month. I couldn't take it anymore. "I don't blame you," I said. "But if you're willing to stay, I'll make sure you never have to deal with that kind of treatment again. You're too valuable to lose." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe me. "You really mean that?" "I do. From now on, your success is my success. If there's something you need, resources, support, anything, you let me know, and I'll make it happen." By the time she walked out of my office, she looked like a different person. The weight she'd been carrying for years had lifted, even if only slightly. And she wasn't the only one. Employee after employee came in, each with their own story of how Kevin had made their lives miserable. Some of them were just grateful he was gone, others needed more convincing that I wasn't just another version of him in a nicer suit. But the more we talked, the more I could see the spark of hope returning. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the changes I was making. There were a handful of people in the office who had thrived under Kevin's regime, not because they were talented, but because they were sycophants. They had spent years cozying up to him, throwing their coworkers under the bus, and reaping the rewards of his favoritism. One of them, a guy named Carl, was particularly vocal about his dissatisfaction. "This whole thing is a joke," he said during one of our team meetings. "You can't just come in here and pretend you know how this company works. You're making changes without even understanding how things are done." "Enlighten me, Carl," I said, leaning back in my chair. "How are things done?" He crossed his arms, clearly annoyed. "For starters, you're giving people way too much freedom. You think Lisa can handle her accounts without someone checking her work? She's been a disaster for years. Kevin was just too nice to fire her." Nice? The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. But I kept my expression neutral. "Lisa landed 3 major clients last year," I said calmly. "And she did it despite Kevin constantly undermining her. If anything, she's been holding this place together." Carl scoffed. "You're kidding yourself if you think she, or anyone else here, can handle the pressure without someone like Kevin keeping them in line. I could feel the tension in the room. The other employees were watching closely, waiting to see how I'd handle this. Carl had clearly been one of Kevin's enforcers, and he was testing me, trying to see if I'd let him get away with the same nonsense. "Carl," I said, my voice steady, "you're right about one thing. I don't plan to run this company the way Kevin did. Because Kevin's way doesn't work. It's why the company was failing before I bought it. So, if you can't get on board with the new direction, I'm happy to accept your resignation." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might actually stand up and walk out. But he didn't. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and slumped back in his chair. The rest of the team stayed silent, but I could see the flicker of approval in their eyes. They were tired of people like Carl, and they were relieved to see that I wasn't going to tolerate his behavior. With Carl effectively neutralized, I turned my attention to the bigger issues. The company's finances were a mess, and it was clear that Kevin had been cutting corners for years just to keep the lights on. I brought in a financial consultant to help me get a clearer picture of what we were dealing with, and the news wasn't great. Wilton Corp was hemorrhaging money, and if we didn't turn things around quickly, it wouldn't matter who was in charge. But I wasn't afraid of hard work. I had rebuilt my own career from the ground up, and I knew I could do the same for this company. I started by streamlining operations, cutting unnecessary expenses, and renegotiating contracts with vendors. I also reached out to some of the clients I had poached during my freelance days, offering them incentives to bring their business back to Wilton Corporation. Most of them agreed, partly because they trusted me and partly because they were eager to see the company succeed without Kevin at the helm. Slowly but surely, the numbers started to improve. It wasn't a dramatic overnight success story, turnarounds like this never are, but we were making progress. More importantly, the employees were starting to believe in the company again. Morale was improving, productivity was up, and the toxic atmosphere Kevin had created was finally starting to fade. One day, as I was walking through the office, I overheard Lisa talking to one of her coworkers. "It actually feels good to come to work now," she said, her voice filled with genuine excitement. "Can you believe it? After all these years, I actually enjoy being here." Hearing that made all the long hours and sleepless nights worth it. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about building something better, something I could be proud of. But I knew the battle wasn't over yet. Kevin might have been gone, but his shadow still lingered. There were still clients and industry insiders who associated Wilton Corp with his failures, and it was going to take time to rebuild the company's reputation. And then there was Kevin himself. He hadn't reached out or tried to interfere since I'd fired him, but I knew him well enough to know he wouldn't go quietly. He was probably out there, plotting his next move, waiting for an opportunity to strike. That was fine. Let him try. I wasn't the same person he'd fired 2 years ago. I was stronger now, smarter, and more determined than ever. Whatever he threw at me, I was ready for it. Things were finally starting to fall into place. Wilton Corp was stabilizing, clients were returning, and the toxic culture Kevin had cultivated was becoming a distant memory. I had turned the company into something I could be proud of, something that was no longer defined by his failures. For the first time in 2 years, I felt like I could breathe. I had won. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Friday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing the quarterly financials, when Lisa burst through the door without knocking. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "You need to see this," she said, holding her phone out to me. "What's going on?" I asked, taking the phone from her. "It's Kevin," she said hesitantly. "He's making accusations." I frowned and looked at the screen. It was a video, posted on Kevin's social media account. He was sitting in what looked like a home office, wearing his trademark smug expression. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. I wanted to share the truth about what's been happening at Wilton Corp since my departure. You see, the man who now owns the company, Ryan, didn't just happen to buy it. He orchestrated my removal. He sabotaged me, stole clients, spread lies, and drove the company into financial trouble, just so he could swoop in and take over. My stomach dropped. Kevin's words were complete nonsense, but he delivered them with such conviction that I could see how people might believe him. It doesn't end there, Kevin continued, leaning closer to the camera for dramatic effect. Ryan's entire business is built on deception. Did you know he funneled money from his agency into the purchase of Wilton Corp? Money that should have gone to paying his employees and contractors. He's been lying to everyone, clients, staff, even the board of directors. The video ended with Kevin staring directly into the camera, his expression smug and triumphant. I'll let the public decide who the real villain is here. But trust me, this story isn't over. I handed the phone back to Lisa, my mind racing. Kevin's claims were completely fabricated, but they were dangerous. He was trying to paint me as a villain, the way he always had. And worse, he was doing it in a way that was calculated to spread quickly. Is anyone taking this seriously? I asked. Lisa hesitated. It's starting to make the rounds online. A few clients have already called to ask about it. I clenched my jaw. This was classic Kevin, trying to destroy me because he couldn't stand that I had outplayed him. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I'll handle it, I said, standing up. Call the PR team. We're going to get ahead of this. The next few days were a whirlwind. I released an official statement refuting Kevin's claims, hired a crisis management consultant, and personally reached out to every major client to reassure them that the allegations were baseless. Most of them believed me. After all, they knew my work ethic and track record, but the damage was already done. Kevin's video had gone viral, and the whispers were spreading. Then came the second bombshell. It was late one night when I got a call from one of my investors. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic. Ryan, he said, I don't know how to say this, but there's something you need to see. He emailed me a set of documents, and as I opened them, my stomach turned to ice. They were financial records from my agency, altered records. Someone had doctored the numbers to make it look like I had been embezzling funds, just as Kevin had claimed. This is fake, I said immediately. I know, the investor replied. But the problem is, Kevin's already sent these to a journalist. A big one. They're running the story tomorrow. I slammed my fist on the desk, fury boiling inside me. Kevin hadn't just stopped at a smear campaign, he'd fabricated evidence to back it up. And now, it was about to hit the press. The article dropped the next morning, and it was brutal. The headline read, From Hero to Villain, the Dark Side of Wilton Corp's New CEO. The story painted me as a manipulative, power-hungry fraud who had orchestrated Kevin's downfall and used shady financial tactics to take over the company. It was everything Kevin wanted the world to believe, and worse, it was working. Clients began pulling their accounts. Employees started whispering behind my back, their trust in me eroding with every passing hour. Even Lisa, who had been my staunchest supporter, seemed shaken. Ryan, she said one evening, is there any truth to this? Any at all? No, I said firmly. It's all lies. You know me, Lisa. You know I'd never do something like this. She nodded, but the doubt in her eyes told me the damage had been done. The breaking point came a week later. I was sitting in my office, trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the company, when my assistant walked in, her face pale. There's someone here to see you, she said hesitantly. Who is it? I asked, barely looking up. It's Kevin. I froze. Send him in. Kevin walked into my office with the same smug grin he'd worn in the video. He looked around the room, taking in the sight of me behind the desk that used to be his. Nice office, he said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Shame about the company, though. Looks like things are falling apart. What do you want, Kevin? I asked coldly. He leaned back in the chair, his grin widening. Oh, I just came to see how you were holding up. I hear the investors are pulling out. Clients too. Rough week, huh? I clenched my fists under the desk. Cut the crap. You're the one behind all of this. Of course I am, he said, his tone almost cheerful. But you have to admit, it's impressive. You took everything from me, Ryan, and now I've taken it all back. You might still own this company on paper, but let's be real, it's dead in the water. And so is your reputation. I stared at him, my mind racing. I wanted to lash out, to make him pay for what he'd done. But then an idea struck me, something so audacious, so risky, that it might actually work. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. You think you've won, don't you? He smirked. Haven't I? Not yet, I said. But you're about to. Kevin frowned, clearly confused. What are you talking about? I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of emails, memos, and other documents I had kept from my time at Wilton Corp., evidence of Kevin's years of unethical behavior. Embezzlement, client manipulation, harassment. It was all there, neatly organized. You see, Kevin, I said, sliding the folder across the desk, I've been keeping receipts. And if you don't back off, if you don't disappear and never show your face in this industry again, I'll make sure everyone sees them. For the first time, Kevin's confidence wavered. He opened the folder and flipped through the documents, his face growing paler with each page. He knew as well as I did that if this information got out, he'd be finished for good. You wouldn't, he said weakly. Try me, I replied. Kevin sat there for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Then he stood up, slamming the folder shut. This isn't over, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Oh, it is, I said. Now get out. He left without another word, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, but I had won the battle. Kevin was gone, his reputation destroyed, and I still had a chance to rebuild mine. But as I sat there, staring at the folder on my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that in the process of destroying Kevin, I had become something dangerously close to him. And that was a truth I'd have to live with.